Elizabeth stumbled backward as Mr. Bingley grabbed her arm to steady her. "Miss Elizabeth," he cried, eyes wide in astonishment. "What are you doing here?" Elizabeth was completely incapacitated with shock. As she struggled to make her lips move, she noticed he looked slightly haggard, as if he had recently been ill. His face seemed somewhat thinner, and his chin had a 5 o'clock shadow, which she couldn't help but think only made him that much more attractive. After trying and failing several times to produce words, she finally managed to whisper, "I came to speak to Mr. Darcy about something." What was it I came to speak to him about again? Her heart felt in danger of exploding. Elizabeth swallowed hard. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Bingley gave her a weak smile. I came to keep Darcy company. He is under the weather, as it were." Elizabeth nodded. "Yes, I know, and it is my fault. I really need to speak to him. Do you know where he is?" "He's in the drawing room. I would take you there myself, but I must get a carriage ready." Is that disappointment in his voice? Are you leaving?" Elizabeth asked, her voice wavering. "I leave for London upon the morrow," Mr. Bingley answered. "I have some business to attend to." "Tell him you lied! Tell him you love him!" There was a split second where she really thought she would, but something about the look in his eyes made Elizabeth hesitate. What if it was too late? What if he had moved on? There you go, being a coward again. Just tell him. Mr. Darcy told you he still loved you. Jane is not in love with him after all. Tell him you have literally nothing to lose. Elizabeth swallowed. Mr. Bingley?" she started. Then that maddeningly persistent truth, that he was simply a figment of her imagination and could disappear at any moment, slapped her cruelly across the face. She slumped her shoulders in defeat. "I should probably find Mr. Darcy," she mumbled, slipping past him through the doorway. "Miss Elizabeth?" he asked tentatively. She turned around to see him smiling at her, and his dimples gave her heart a jolt of adrenaline. "It's wonderful to see you." Mr. Bingley bowed. She beamed back helplessly and watched as he turned and walked away down the empty hallway. He threw one last devastating smile over his shoulder before disappearing around a corner. Elizabeth entered the drawing room to find her aunt and uncle deep in conversation with Mr. Darcy. Her initial thought when she saw him was that he too looked as if he had been ill. His handsome face was drawn, and he had dark circles under his eyes. A movement in the corner of her eye made her turn to see Caroline Bingley and a strange young woman with black hair talking animatedly on a settee. They glanced up as she walked past, wearing identical expressions of derision that made Elizabeth subconsciously scowl back at them. When she reached Mr. Darcy, she curtsied and gave him a penitent look. He smiled warmly and bowed. "Miss Elizabeth, it is a pleasure to welcome Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner and yourself to Pemberley." Keeping an eye on Caroline, who had risen from her chair and appeared ready to pounce, Elizabeth asked, Mr. Darcy, may I please have a word with you in private?" She felt Caroline encroaching and gave him an insistent look. "Right now, perhaps?" Sensing the urgency in her eyes, Mr. Darcy replied, "Of course." He turned to Caroline, who had reached his side and was taunting Elizabeth with her unrelenting glare. "Caroline, would you please offer Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner some refreshment?" Caroline smiled grudgingly and curtsied. Mr. Darcy led Elizabeth into a room with a large desk and tall leather armchairs. As soon as they were inside, she quickly shut the door behind them. Mr. Darcy looked at her questioningly and opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Elizabeth blurted out, "Jane loves you." "Pardon?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. "I was wrong. I thought Jane was in love with someone else, but I was wrong. She loves you, Mr. Darcy." Mr. Darcy gazed at her in disbelief. He looked away toward the window, then back at Elizabeth. "Are you certain?" "Yes." Elizabeth stressed. She has loved you since the Meryton ball. It was my own stupidity that made you think she didn't care. I am so sorry. You have no idea how sorry I am. But you must go to her and tell her how you feel. I know she would say yes if you asked her to marry you. Elizabeth watched Mr. Darcy's expression slowly transform from skepticism to sheer exhilaration. His broad smile lit up every inch of his face. Elizabeth felt taken back, as she had never witnessed any representation of Mr. Darcy in film or in her own mind appear so radiantly happy. She clasped her hands tightly in front of her and beamed with delight. For once, she was the bearer of good news. Then she gasped as he suddenly threw caution to the wind and wrapped his arms around her in a bear hug, lifting her right off the ground before swiftly setting her back down again. Forgive me, Miss Elizabeth. I am terribly sorry for my impertinence. Indeed, I could not be more... This is the most sensational news. Thank you, Miss Elizabeth. You are a messenger from heaven above. He kissed Elizabeth's hands. I must go to her. Is she here in Derbyshire? No, she's at Longbourn. Elizabeth breathed, blushing furiously as she waited for her pulse to return to normal. Whew. No matter. I will leave at once, Mr. Darcy declared, releasing her and pacing the room frantically. He ran his trembling fingers through his hair. No, I must make arrangements for my sister before I leave. Upon the morrow, then, I will go and tell them to make ready the carriage. He walked back to Elizabeth and kissed her hand once more. I can never thank you enough, Miss Elizabeth. Should there ever be anything I can do for you, name it and it is done. It would be my pleasure. Elizabeth blushed again as she thought of the playful smile Mr. Bingley had given her moments earlier. Could I possibly ask you a question, Mr. Darcy? Of course, anything. I'm just curious. She began, cheeks ablaze. Would you ever, you think, do something completely crazy, like, I don't know, take your clothes off and dive into a lake? Mr. Darcy's smile faltered. I beg your pardon? Elizabeth squeezed her eyes shut tight. Like something impetuous and stupid. Like going for a swim in a lake. Just for the fun of it? Mr. Darcy stared at her, as if she just asked him if he liked pina coladas and getting caught in the rain. Miss Elizabeth, he replied carefully, I would not even consider partaking in an activity as marked for lunacy as swimming in a natural body of water instead of the confines of a tub. I have never made the acquaintance of any man fool enough to make a mockery of himself in that manner. He gave her a puzzled smile and bowed. Then he left the room. Elizabeth stared at the closed door for a full minute. Then she laughed out loud. She couldn't help it. The mental image of Mr. Bingley strutting backward as he undid his cravat, then diving headfirst into the lake, made her laugh until her sides hurt. She didn't even stop when a servant peeked hesitantly into the room and asked her if she was all right. She simply waved him away, her hands on her knees, as he cast a fearful look at her and closed the door. When she finally managed to compose herself, Elizabeth wiped the tears that were streaming down her cheeks and stood up straight. She inhaled deeply, full of fresh determination and confidence. She no longer cared what anyone thought. She no longer cared if Mr. Bingley wasn't real. He was real for now, and now was all she needed. She was ready. Elizabeth held her head high and walked straight through the door and past the servant, who backed up against the wall as she passed. She smiled at him self-assuredly. It was time. Time to find Mr. Bingley and tell him he wasn't the only fool in love. She hurried back to the drawing room, thinking it was empty, until she saw the dark-haired girl sitting at the piano, shuffling through songs. When Elizabeth entered the room, she glanced up at her. "Oh," Elizabeth exclaimed. "Excuse me, but have you seen Mr. Bingley?" The girl swung her legs around the bench to face Elizabeth and folded her hands in her lap. "Why exactly do you seek Mr. Bingley?" she asked calmly. "I just need to talk to him. It's important. Do you happen to know where he might be?" "I believe he is giving your aunt and uncle a tour of the grounds, Miss Elizabeth Bennet," the girl offered. "It is Miss Elizabeth Bennet, is it not?" "Oh," Elizabeth exclaimed again. She realized she had probably come across as rude for not introducing herself. "I'm sorry, yes, I am Elizabeth Bennet, more or less. And you are Georgiana Darcy, am I right?" "Yes, I am." They stared at each other in silence for a few seconds. "Well, I'm just gonna go find Mr. Bingley. It was nice to meet you, Georgiana." Elizabeth turned to leave. "I do not believe there is anything you could say to Mr. Bingley that he would have any desire to hear, Miss Elizabeth," Georgiana uttered coldly. Elizabeth turned back around. "Excuse me?" Georgiana's smile was dark. "I have heard all about you, Miss Elizabeth. Caroline told me everything. From your appalling manners to your complete lack of connection or fortune. I wonder at your nerve coming here to my home and presenting yourself before Mr. Bingley and my brother as though you believed yourself equal with us. If I were you, I would avoid speaking with anyone else and leave immediately with your uncouth relations, before the three of you humiliate yourself any further." Elizabeth's jaw stiffened. She could feel righteous anger boil up inside of her. Is she joking? "Yes, you certainly seem to have me pegged, Georgiana. Caroline was very thorough in her description of me. But don't worry, I would never presume to call you my equal. To call myself your equal." She paused as Georgiana sniffed in superiority. "That would be far too kind of me. You are vastly inferior to myself and my uncouth relations when it comes to your ability to remotely resemble a decent human being." "You have the audacity to say such things to me? Do you know who I am? What I could do to you?" Elizabeth nodded. "I know exactly who you are, Georgiana Darcy. Not only have you treated your brother like your own personal ATM and lied to him repeatedly, but you also destroyed the life of a good friend of mine, with absolutely no remorse." Georgiana gave her a scathing look. "Of whom do you speak, may I ask?" "Why, have you destroyed the lives of more than one man? I wouldn't be the least bit surprised." Elizabeth rolled her eyes. "I am talking about George Wickham." "Ah, George Wickham. The poor fool. My transgressions toward him were nothing compared to his own." "You used him to get away from your brother, so you could gamble your inheritance away." Elizabeth knew she was raising her voice, but she didn't care. "You lied and told him you were in love with him. You begged him to elope, not even caring that his feelings for you might have been real. And when he told you he couldn't go through with it, you told your brother he was marrying you for your money alone, and threatened to expose him if he didn't comply, knowing full well that his reputation would be ruined." Georgiana stood slowly and slithered like a cobra, stopping within inches of her face. Elizabeth could feel Georgiana's breath hot on her cheeks and flinched, but she stood her ground and gritted her teeth, unwilling to allow her to intimidate her by invading her personal space. "George Wickham is an imbecile," Georgiana hissed. "He deserved his fate, which is still preferable to my own. My entire life I have been overlooked and underestimated because of my sex and viewed as a pawn in the pursuit of power and advantage designed by men. Why should I not be cleverer than them if I can and take what is owed to me, since I have not the independence to acquire it for myself? My brother is an imbecile, for being so blinded by his affection for me that manipulating him is almost too simple. And Mr. Bingley is an imbecile, for languishing after you instead of pursuing a lady of his own status. But no matter. You were foolish enough to refuse him. Now I will benefit from him just as I would George Wickham. I will persuade Mr. Bingley to become my betrothed, and then take command of his affluence as his intended wife, in any manner I desire. Mr. Bingley's fortune is much more substantial than George Wickham's. Therefore, I must thank you for your cruelty to him, Miss Elizabeth. I could understand your frustration at being overlooked and underestimated because of your sex if you didn't sound like a spoiled brat having a tantrum, Elizabeth reasoned. You are a woman of privilege, Georgiana. You have more money at your disposal than you know what to do with, since you decided to gamble it away rather than use it toward a more meaningful purpose. You don't even know what it is to be truly without freedom of choice, she added, thinking of Charlotte. Why don't you quit playing the victim and go out and do something worthwhile? Stop thinking only of yourself and try to make someone else's life better. Someone who doesn't have the advantages you were born with. Maybe you could start a school for girls and teach them useful skill sets that could help them find independence of their own. You expect me to squander my family's fortune on charity? Georgiana puzzled. How would raising other women above their station improve my own circumstances? It's called empowerment, Georgiana. Elizabeth tried not to sound gruff, seeing as the concept was thus far foreign to her. Women have been taught to be in competition with one another since the dawn of time. But the truth is, if we want change, if we want to topple the patriarchy, we need to raise each other up instead of tearing one another down. One woman alone has power, but collectively we have impact. I read that somewhere once, and it changed my whole outlook on female relationships. We need to reverse the stereotype that women don't help women, because it only weakens us. Collaborating our strengths is how we'll change the equation. Plus, it's a lot more fun to have a squad than to fly solo. I would much rather fly solo than raise someone such as yourself to my standing, Georgiana retorted. I am not so naive as to share my advantages with unaccomplished social climbers. Yep, spoiled brat. Either this girl has never had a positive role model or she's just inherently evil. Okay. Well, I tried. Sorry if most of that went right over your head, but take some time. Think about it. You're not naive, Georgiana. You've just been made to think you are, so you'll continue to sit still and look pretty. And you're unhappy because you're bored. You don't need a man to get whatever it is that you want in life. You'd be better off going out and finding it on your own than you would be entering a marriage that you don't want in the first place. You think you're trapped now, but trust me, that would be an entirely different form of captivity, especially in this era. You'd only end up the puppet instead of the puppeteer. Do you include yourself in this diverting speech? Perhaps I should apprise Mr. Bingley of your opinion of his character, as well as your opinion of what entering into matrimony with him would be like. I'm not the one who wants to marry a man solely for his money, Elizabeth seethed. Marriage is not considered a trap if love is involved in the decision. It is unimportant, as there is nothing you could possibly say to inspire me to alter my course of action. You are frail and ineffectual in comparison with me, Georgiana scoffed. As well as a fool, since you did not see the merit in availing yourself to Mr. Bingley's fortune when your relations are reduced to sharing their rooms at Longbourn with swine. That's it. Elizabeth felt her rage boil over until she completely lost her ability to reason. Without thinking, she pulled back her fist and sunk it deep into Georgiana's nose, causing her to launch backward onto the floor with her hands flailing about helplessly. She pulled herself to a sitting position and gaped at Elizabeth, eyes wide in shock as she wiped the blood from her face with her sleeves. As she stood over her, Elizabeth felt just as surprised as Georgiana at what she had just done. Never in her wildest dreams had she punched someone in the face. At least not until now. That was for George Wickham. She turned to leave, shaking out her hand and contorting her face from the pain, when she heard Georgiana shout her name. Glaring over her shoulder, Elizabeth saw her victim attempting to wipe away the blood that was now pouring down her neck to her gown. What? She asked dangerously. Georgiana struggled to reclaim the last shred of her dignity by standing to face her, but tripped on her hem and collapsed back onto the floor in a heap. He will never forgive you, she threatened. He is going to choose me. I will win. Elizabeth gave her a pitying look. You shouldn't have underestimated me either, Georgiana. Just because I'm from a lower social class doesn't mean I'm weak and ineffectual. Besides, I'm uncouth, remember? I'm not above punching you a second time. She paused. It's a shame, that you live both in Regency England and inside my head. Because you would love the 21st century. We've still got a ways to go with women's rights, but at least corsets are long gone. Wait, Georgiana managed to shout before choking and sputtering on her own blood. Elizabeth set her face, then turned back once more. Can't you recognize when to call it quits, Georgiana? You're relentless, I'll give you that, but not exactly menacing in your current state. I don't even know how you're going to get back up in that thing. You look like a turtle on its back right now. I'm relentless? I am? Georgiana shrieked. I am not the one who hoodwinked a man into becoming enamored of her, then destroyed him merely to demonstrate her cruelty, leaving him so tormented that he was unable to eat or drink or even live. I was in Mr. Bingley's company in London, and he was all but dead inside. I did not then pursue his closest friend in matrimony, journeying all the way to his private home to secure his more substantial fortune. I know that is why you sought an audience with my brother here at Pemberley. I may use people to achieve what I desire, Miss Bennet. However, I am not the one responsible for seducing an honest gentleman, then wounding him until he is made physically ill over it. Mr. Wickham was never a gentleman to begin with, so my abuse toward him is not nearly as reprehensible as what you have done to Mr. Bingley. You fragmented his heart, now I will be the one to pick up the pieces. My treatment of him, regardless of the absence of love, will be a kindness compared with the damage you have inflicted. Elizabeth staggered backward until her back hit the wall. She couldn't breathe. She really couldn't. She gasped and choked on air as tears spilled down her cheeks, staring at Georgiana as though she were holding a smoking gun to her chest. And if you do not leave Pemberley this very minute, without uttering so much as one word to either Mr. Bingley or my brother of what I have said, I will apprise everyone I encounter of Wickham's secret. He foolishly informed me of his shocking predisposition, and I will not hesitate to betray his confidences. How long do you believe he will last in the regiment if word gets out that he joined for more than comradeship? Georgiana rose surprisingly fast and walked closer to Elizabeth. I require Mr. Bingley's fortune, as my inheritance has dwindled significantly, and I cannot risk my brother's displeasure when he discovers what became of it. You will never tell Mr. Bingley that you regret refusing him. Do you understand? Never. Or your precious Mr. Wickham will be begging on the streets like a dog. She was now so close to Elizabeth's face she could almost smell the metallic scent of her blood. What was it with this girl and boundaries? It appears you will have to choose between friendship and love. I wonder which it will be. Elizabeth stared at Georgiana's hateful face, made gruesome by the trails of dried blood down her chin and neck and the two brilliant black eyes that were rapidly forming. She could not speak. Instead, she backed slowly through the doorway until she was in the hall. Then she turned and walked as fast as she could toward the front door. Mr. Darcy was nowhere to be seen. He was presumably off preparing for his journey to Longbourn. When she reached the foyer, Elizabeth opened the gargantuan front door and slammed it shut behind her. Then she leaned her back against it and cried bitterly. She saw her uncle's empty carriage, and an overwhelming sense of entrapment overcame her. She wished desperately that she could free one of the horses and ride away, with the deafening roar of the wind blocking out all thought until she were somewhere, anywhere but Pemberley. With an urge to flee, Elizabeth hitched up her skirt up to her knees and began to run as fast as she could, the sharp stones of the roadway stabbing her feet like glass through the thin soles of her shoes. The physical pain was nothing compared to the way her heart was feeling. In comparison, it felt good. She ran through the garden, gaining speed until she tripped on a tree root and fell roughly to the ground, tumbling a few times before coming to a halt in the grass. Ignoring the searing pain in her forehead, Elizabeth hugged her knees to her chest and rocked back and forth, sobbing as loudly as she wanted now that she was out of earshot. The worst part, the very worst part of Georgiana's speech, was that it was true. Except for the part about pursuing Mr. Darcy, which, let's face it, was also true until I realized I didn't love him. Everything Georgiana said about Elizabeth's treatment of Mr. Bingley was accurate. She knew that whatever awaited her on the other side of this dream, death, a vegetative state, or the torture of a life without Mr. Bingley, it couldn't be worse than the purgatory she was currently in. Elizabeth squeezed her eyes shut and chanted, "Wake up, wake up, wake up," over and over in her mind. When she reopened them, however, she was still sitting in the grass with skinned elbows, staring at the now irritatingly elegant estate of Pemberley. She stood up and began to walk back toward the house, picking pieces of debris from her hair and limping slightly. As she made her way through the garden, Elizabeth noticed her aunt and uncle approaching, accompanied by Mr. Bingley. When she saw her niece, Mrs. Gardiner rushed over to her. "What in the world happened, Lizzie?" Elizabeth merely shook her head in reply. "I'm ready to leave now." Her uncle looked her over, his eyes concerned. "I will inform the coachman." He turned toward Mr. Bingley. "I cannot thank you enough for your hospitality this afternoon, Mr. Bingley," he said with a bow. "Please give my regards to Mr. Darcy, and thank him as well. Viewing Pemberley at length has been an aspiration for my wife since her childhood." He and Mrs. Gardiner walked over to the carriage, leaving Elizabeth alone with Mr. Bingley. He glanced briefly at her, then sucked in his breath as he reached out and brushed her hair away from her face. "Miss Elizabeth, you are bleeding." He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and gently mopped the blood from her brow. She chewed her bottom lip as his face drew near hers. His blue eyes narrowed in concentration. "Is your head painful?" Mr. Bingley asked, carefully meeting her gaze. His eyes were growing bluer by the second. Elizabeth's eyes drifted downward to his mouth. "I can't feel anything at the moment." He pulled a few blades of grass from her hair and lifted her chin with one crooked finger as he inspected a small scrape. "Did you fall?" Mr. Bingley was now staring at her lips as though he would very much like to make it all better, and Elizabeth felt herself mentally willing him to give it a try. He settled for taking her hand and wiping the dirt from a shallow cut, then bringing her open palm to his mouth and brushing his lips against it softly. "No," Elizabeth breathed, closing her eyes in anticipation. "Why do you ask?" Mr. Bingley took a step back and eyed her disheveled gown, covered in patches of dirt and grass stains, and the scrapes on her arms. "Oh, no reason." She gave him a frustrated curtsy, then began to walk toward the carriage. "Miss Elizabeth," she heard him call. Elizabeth turned around. "I was longing to speak with you before you left." She felt hope rise inside of her chest and open her mouth to answer him, but was distracted by the sound of the door opening. They both looked over to see Georgiana, clean and in a fresh gown, but still strongly resembling a raccoon, standing on the threshold glaring at Elizabeth. Before she had time to react, Elizabeth saw Georgiana shake her head slowly from side to side. She gasped. Mr. Bingley's eyes traveled from Elizabeth to Georgiana, then back to Elizabeth in confusion. Elizabeth felt fresh tears sting her eyes as she whispered, "I have to go." She climbed into the carriage, realizing as she glanced down at her clenched fist that she was still holding Mr. Bingley's handkerchief. If she had looked back through the window, if she looked through the back window as they pulled away, Elizabeth would have seen Mr. Bingley walk over to Georgiana and exchange angry words with her before she went back inside and slammed the door shut in his face.